Okay, welcome back. And tonight, having talked in general last time about the ideas of this constitutional system or this colonial system that emerged in the 17th and 18th century, we'll talk about what happens as the system begins to break down in a big and dramatic way, in events that are well known to us, but we'll be approaching this not from the standpoint of military history and so on, but rather from the standpoint of constitutional history. As I mentioned, we have this system that emerged. That is, there wasn't a grand plan on the part of the British to create an empire, and yet by the 1760s, the British discovered that in fact they had an empire, and then tried to figure out a way to regulate it better. And this isn't the time to talk about the grandeur of the British Empire, how by the 1760s the British had taken India and beat the French all over the world and became the dominant power in the world. But it happened. And part of this, a very important component of being an empire, of course, are colonies. And the North American colonies weren't the central part of Britain's imperial ambition. In fact, if we were in England in the 1750s, 60s, talking about the colonies, we would not be thinking about Massachusetts or Virginia or these other places which were important to the British Empire only to the degree to which they sustained the other British colonies, the really important ones, Barbados, Jamaica, and India, which becomes the British East India Company, takes over by the 1760s with implications for us. Now, in the early 1760s, the British Parliament passed a series of laws as a way of regulating colonial trade and making sense of this empire. Tax on sugar, and then a stamp tax as a way of... Americans look at this in a particular way, and I know at least we have one employee of the National Park Service here who's going to correct me on this. I'm not going to point him out. He's probably the one who's beginning to fume. But, Americans like to say, the British fought this big war with the French and then tried to pay off their debt by taxing Americans, which isn't the case. Yes, the British fought this big war. From the British point of view, of course, it was a war fought for the benefit of these folks in these colonies. The war was a very expensive thing, but there's no way that the taxes imposed in the 1760s would have come close to paying this debt. And in fact, people in England were taxed much more heavily than people in the American colonies. Instead, these tax laws were a way of regulating trade and cutting down on smuggling so that the revenues that derived from this great trade Americans were engaged in would accrue to the benefit of the empire as a whole. Of course, the Americans then as now saw this a bit differently, and for them the primary point was not the British are trying to pay their debts by taxing us. The primary point was, up till this point we have only been taxed by our own representatives. Any attempt by somebody which we have not chosen to tax us is taking away our power to govern ourselves and is a step toward our enslavement. You can have a seat. So different points of view on what is happening here in the 1760s. And there was great outcry in the American colonies over the stamp tax that Parliament passed in 1765, and Parliament wound up rescinding it in 1766, partly because Parliament recognized the cost of enforcing this tax was greater than any revenue the tax might generate. And Americans, of course, interpreted the rescinding of the stamp tax differently. We protested and Parliament backed down. Now, Parliament, in rescinding the stamp tax, did not give up the idea that Parliament could govern, or was the governing force in the empire. The Declaratory Act, 1766, which was the act by which Parliament repealed the stamp tax, declared that the British Parliament governed the colonies in all cases whatsoever. a pretty straightforward statement. Benjamin Franklin said, "This is only a wise policy if you choose never to enforce it." But Parliament was insisting that it governed the empire as it governed in England. The Americans had a different point of view, and we could discuss this kind of intellectual problem this poses. If Parliament doesn't govern the American colonies, who does? Is each colony then independent? And that's actually something that a discussion that arises actually right here in 1773 when Governor Hutchinson opens the Massachusetts Assembly with a long speech explaining the role of the Massachusetts Assembly in the British Empire. And that role, he told the members of the Assembly, was quite limited. Anyway, this is what's happening in the 1760s, an attempt by Parliament to work out its role in governing the empire and resistance on the part of these American colonies to being governed. And there are a number of big episodes in this that we could talk about at another time. 1768, various riots in Boston over the arrival of British troops, and in 1770, of course, bloodshed in Boston, and the British troops in New York cutting down a liberty pole, and other episodes like this, culminating, of course, in 1773 when Parliament passes the Tea Act, by which Parliament gets control of the British East India Company, which is a great thing for the Parliament, and it bails out the company and also gives the company a monopoly on all tea sold in British North America. And the result in Boston, of course, was the destruction of 9,000 pounds worth of East India Company tea in December of 1773. As John Adams called this, the grandest moment of all, this great act of civil disobedience, which precipitates a crisis then, because the Parliament doesn't say, after the Boston Tea Party, as we've come to call it, well, you have a point. Maybe we shouldn't have imposed this tax and given the company a monopoly. The Parliament says something much different. They close down the Port of Boston until Boston pays for this tea. They suspend the government of Massachusetts. They do away with the town meetings, seeing these simply as mob rule. The town meetings, which constantly were speaking on the behalf of the town. Very interesting development here, that the Americans had more power of self-government than anyone else in the world, really. And the town meetings of Massachusetts weren't just a collection of individuals voicing their grievances. They actually were formal political bodies that spoke for the town. And development, too, in the early 1770s with Samuel Adams, who was a leader of the Boston town meeting, as well as a leader of the Massachusetts Assembly, creating in the Boston town meeting a committee of correspondence, whose role would be to correspond with the town meetings in other towns. Not just groups of like-minded people acting as pen pals, but these are formal bodies of the town meeting, appointed by the town meeting, who tended to have similar ideas to Mr. Adams or Mr. Otis or Mr. Quincy, or whomever else was on the Boston town meeting or Boston Committee of Correspondence, and then on behalf of the Massachusetts Assembly creating a committee of correspondence to correspond with the assemblies in the other colonies. There was no formal connection between or among these American colonies. Each one was an independent entity whose only real communication would be through the governor, who was a crown official, or through London. But the committees of correspondence then function as a communication system among these colonial governments. And Adams creates these beginning in about 1771, 1772. By 1773, every colony has a committee of correspondence, and all of the towns in Massachusetts have a committee of correspondence to keep in touch with these other colonies. So we see developing here a communication network among like-minded folks in these American colonies, which aren't simply reporting on the weather, but are instead talking about these common grievances or developing a common identity, not identity quite yet, but a common idea of grievances against the British regimes. It's unclear how all of this is going to play out in 1773. But in 1774, when the Parliament strikes back by shutting down the Massachusetts government, suspending the town meetings, and appointing a new governor, another one of the grievances in Massachusetts was Governor Hutchinson was abusing his power and so on. And the Parliament, as a way of getting even, does send a new governor, and this is General Thomas Gage, who is the commander of all military forces in British North America. And Gage arrives in June of 1774, and quite quickly, Gage steps into a very difficult situation. He insists that Parliament and the Crown do have the power to suspend the Massachusetts government. And the Massachusetts Assembly is meeting in the old State House, choosing delegates to go to a Continental Congress. Massachusetts wants all of the colonies to get together so that they hopefully will side with Massachusetts, and the delegates to the Assembly are choosing their delegates to this Congress as the Secretary of the province is nailing to the door a proclamation from the governor that the Assembly is dissolved, which a governor can do. So Gage dissolves the Assembly, and then we see a process beginning, and it's a process that will happen in each of the other colonies, roughly over the next year or so, of the government established by the Charter, or the government sanctioned by the British Crown, collapsing, as people withdraw their support from it and instead will support a different government. Essentially, it happens like this. Gage dissolves the Assembly, says you can't meet here anymore. The members of the Assembly who were elected by the town meetings, and Gage has also said no more town meetings, so you can't elect any more delegates. Also, there was the Governor's Council that had been chosen by the Assembly, which the governor could veto. Governor could veto appointments to the Assembly. If you go to the Massachusetts State Archives, look at the records of the Assembly in the early 1770s, as every year the Assembly is nominating their members of the Governor's Council, and every year the Assembly, 1771, 2, 3, nominates John Adams, and you can see the governor simply draws a line through the name. Doesn't want Adams on the Governor's Council, as he doesn't want other folks on the Governor's Council. But now, no more will the Assembly get to choose members of the Governor's Council. Those councilors will be appointed by the governor. And the town meetings no longer will choose sheriffs, magistrates, tax collectors. Those all will be appointees of the governor. So you have Governor Gage. And in fact, I don't think people in Massachusetts ever refer to him as Governor Gage, do they? And it's always General Gage. Yeah, we don't recognize his legitimacy, even now. So if you write Governor Gage on one of your papers, not only am I going to have to mark you wrong, I'm going to have to report you to, the Committee of Safety, I think? Okay. So you have Gage appointing these individuals to hold these various offices, and people in the towns not acknowledging their authority. And Gage appointing people to a governor's council. The Assembly chooses its own councilors. And you have Gage calling for the Assembly to meet in Salem, an Assembly chosen under the rules he sets out, not, the town, there can be a sanctioned town meeting. The towns can't meet whenever they want. But then you also have the towns meeting surreptitiously, choosing their own delegates to a provincial congress, which meets in Watertown. So you have two different governing bodies emerging. A government under Gage that meets in Salem, and it had been a long-standing goal of various governors to move the government out of Boston. Because in Boston, the government was too susceptible to pressure from the Boston mob. Move it to a safer place like Cambridge or Salem, where the Boston mob wouldn't be quite so vociferous. But then so you do have this government supposedly going to meet in Salem. Another government emerges in Watertown. And which is the legitimate government? One has the imprimatur of the king. Gage has a commission from the king to govern, and the other doesn't. And what the provincial Congress simply does is say, we're operating under the 1691 charter. And in fact, the government in Watertown looks very much like the old provincial assembly, but we don't have a governor. That office is vacant. Very interesting development. And then, of course, the real test is going to be which one people will listen to. Not just for simple things like, one government says the speed limit is 55, the other says it's 60. No, it's things like, are you going to pay taxes to one or the other? If one says you need to send so many men into military service, are they going to go? Which is going to be the legitimate government? Very important question here. So you have what happens, just to put this more simply, Gage comes not to have any real authority outside of Boston, an area controlled by his troops. And the other government comes to have the support of more people throughout the province. Now, this is a process that happens in other colonies as well. The process of the sanctioned government collapsing and a new government emerging that in many ways looks like the old one, but doesn't have the governor, except in places like Rhode Island and Connecticut, where the assembly gets to choose the governor. But people withdraw their support from the British government or the old government and instead will support this new one, for the most part. It happens differently in different places. In South Carolina, it's really quite a vicious civil war that ensues over the next 8 years. But here in Massachusetts, there are episodes of mobbing. The Tories on Brattle Street are pretty much driven out by armed force. People in the hinterlands in Massachusetts find it better to live under the protection of the British government in Boston than to stay in these rebellious towns. There are lots of interesting stories in many of the towns of Massachusetts. Barnstable is a fascinating case, where Barnstable is the only town, and maybe the only town in the country, that votes against declaring independence in 1776. I think every other town in the country claims not only were we for it, it was our idea to begin with. But in Barnstable, the town meeting said no to independence, and then to get even, the Sons of Liberty in Barnstable tarred and feathered this old widow who didn't like the Sons of Liberty. And a very interesting story. Anyone familiar with this, by the way? I'm not making this up. Anyone from Barnstable? I'm going to call you into account. Barnstable also kept electing to this provincial congress a fellow named Edward Bacon, who was a loyalist. He thought that independence was going to be difficult to sustain, very dangerous, and he also didn't like the kinds of folks who were involved in this whole movement. Apparently there was this big personality struggle in Barnstable among the Otises, who were, of course, the leaders of the whole independence movement, and then another faction in Barnstable, trying to remember their name. They're not building statues of them. They kept a tavern, famous tavern in Barnstable. Maybe I've spent too much time in taverns now to remember this particular name. Anyway, I apologize, but big personality struggle between them, and Bacon said, do you want to be governed by these jackals? And people of Barnstable thought he had a point. In fact, a fist fight breaks out among the militia, the Patriot militia, between Joseph Otis and the leader of this other Patriot faction. Doesn't really bode well for, you can see why Barnstable might have been a little reluctant to go along with this. Anyway, I apologize for this digression. But it is, in each town, you see a decision like this being made. Which is the legitimate government here? And how do we constitute a legitimate government? What gives a government legitimacy? Is it the sanction of the British Crown, or is it something else? And it's a story that happens in each of these colonies. Now, as I mentioned, in 1774, the Massachusetts and the other colonies held a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. A Congress in the 18th century sense was simply a meeting of people with a similar idea or similar calling. It would be what we would consider a trade convention today. You know, when all the dentists meet in Boston, they're not coming up with some big policy that all of us are going to have to follow until they strap us into the chair. But, you know, they're simply meeting to talk about what's happening in dentistry, so it doesn't have any law-making abilities. So this Congress is simply a big meeting. And it meets in Philadelphia, and it's not quite clear what is going to be the result of it. Certainly, the delegates from Massachusetts, the Adamses, John Adams and Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, do want the other colonies to side with Massachusetts. There are folks in other colonies who agree that, yes, we have to side with Massachusetts. Then there are others who may think Massachusetts really brought this on themselves. And there were some, like the Adamses certainly, who were beginning to have this idea that these colonies should be independent of the British Crown. But they're not going to say that publicly because that would be treason. Instead, what they want is for the British Crown, or I'm sorry, not the Crown, but the Parliament, to stop meddling in their affairs. They all acknowledge that the king is the head of the empire, and our assembly stands in relationship between us and the crown in the same way that the parliament stands in relation between the people of England and the crown. We can't be governed by parliament any more than the Massachusetts Assembly could govern people in England. And so you have this idea, okay, so folks in other colonies who don't want independence, or even people in Massachusetts who think independence will never work, because here we're talking about being governed by the most powerful empire in the world. How would we ever fight a war to maintain independence against the British Army or Navy? Think we don't. The crisis has been brought on by parliamentary meddling in our governments. We want Parliament to let us keep our governments, and we'll all exist happily under this system. Quite similar to something Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Hutchinson had proposed back in 1754, a system which looks very much like the British Commonwealth system that emerged in the 19th century, you know, whereby places like Australia and later and Jamaica and Barbados and India would all have their legislatures or their assemblies, but look at the monarch as the head of state. You know, so you have different ideas about what might happen here. And Joseph Galloway, who is a Philadelphia politician, Galloway was a leader of the assembly in Philadelphia, or in Pennsylvania, I'm sorry. And in fact, the big issue in Pennsylvania for the last 20 years or so before this was Galloway and Benjamin Franklin and others wanted to take Pennsylvania away from the Penn family because they didn't get along with the proprietor. You know, the Penns owned Philadelphia. They got to choose the governor, and they didn't like that, so they wanted the king to take Pennsylvania and have a royal governor instead of a Penn governor. So that had been one of Galloway's big causes. And here in 1774, he proposed something like the Albany Plan, you know, with the king appointing governors and having some kind of a council of all of the colonies, Parliament not meddling. Others took a more radical view, like Patrick Henry from Virginia, who said we're in a state of nature. That is, this crisis has eliminated the old governments. Now we have to start anew. So you have kind of different ideas at this Continental Congress. And for most, the ultimate goal was reconciliation as part of the British Empire. It didn't seem like there was any other reasonable goal they could have. They recognized that things were bad with Massachusetts. The rest of us want to remain loyal, and you can see there are a number of different choices you can have if you want to end the crisis. One is to tell these hotheads in Massachusetts to stop causing trouble, which is certainly what the Crown expected to happen. The other is to say, we support Massachusetts because if the British Parliament can shut down Boston Harbor and can suspend their government, they can also suspend our government, and we don't want that to happen. And again, you can see a number of different ways that might play out. We don't want that to happen, so we won't cause any trouble, or we don't want that to happen, so we'll join Massachusetts in opposing this trend of events. And you have, over the next year or so, the governments in these colonies crumbling as leaders and others try to find some way out of this crisis, both here and in England. In neither case is there a unified idea about what's happening. In fact, there are lots of folks in England who think this all is the fault of inept leaders in the British Parliament. You know, remember, England has a parliamentary system which has elections for office in Parliament, and the role of the King has been expanding, and there is significant opposition to that idea. Lord North really is the King's minister in Parliament, and he wants to hold on to a majority. The opposition, of course, wants to get him out, so they attack the American policy quite vigorously. And what happens, just to let you in on what does happen here, in February of 1775, Parliament declares that Massachusetts is in a state of rebellion. And later in the month, actually Lord North proposes kind of a compromise proposal in February of 1775. Have Parliament refrain from taxing the colonists, have the assemblies agree to collect taxes and send the revenues to England, and Gage, General Gage here in Boston, receives instructions on the first part. Massachusetts is in a state of rebellion. You should do something to stifle the rebellion. At about the same time as there's this proposal floating in Parliament to not have Parliament tax the colonies anymore. And in the winter and spring of 1775, Gage sends military force to various places throughout Massachusetts to collect arms that the colonists are stockpiling. Bad sign. If the colonists are stockpiling arms in your General Gage, you know, that's a bad thing. You want to stop them from doing that. And one way is to give in to their demands. The other way is simply to go out and capture the arms, which Gage does. And on April 19th of 1775, the British forces go out to Lexington and Concord and do seize the weapons that are being stockpiled there. And the militia forces from throughout eastern Massachusetts, even southern New Hampshire, from Rhode Island and Connecticut, converge on this area between Concord and Boston. And, you know, the beginning of the day, Gage's forces surprise the militia at Lexington. Well, the militia also surprises the British by being mobilized. Then at Concord, the forces are met by this combined militia, and then the British are forced to retreat back to Boston. By the end of the day, Gage's forces are besieged in Boston, where they will be for the next until March of 1776. Okay, so just to kind of make sense of this big story. You have this Congress which begins to meet in 1774 and comes up with various proposals to try to work out this crisis, sending a petition to the King saying, you've got some bad ministers giving you the wrong advice, Parliament is overstepping, we don't want war. You have the King responding by declaring Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion, and then violence happening in Massachusetts in April of 1775. And then the Congress reconvenes in May of 1775 in the wake of this violence. And in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which is meeting out in Watertown, asks Congress what it should do. You know, we've been functioning as though we're just waiting for a governor. But now it's quite clear the governor has made war on us. And the Congress recommends that Massachusetts keep doing this until the crisis is resolved. John Adams, who is both a guy from Massachusetts and a member of Congress, thinks that what Congress should do is tell each of the colonies to draw up a new provisional government because the old one is collapsing. He sees that the states are going to draw up their own new governments anyway, or create some new system, and he wants Congress to guide them. But others in Congress, who still, even in the wake of Lexington and Concord, don't see independence as the cause, are reluctant to tell these colonies, draw up a new system of government. Well, why should you if all we're waiting for is for a change of ministry in England, someone other than Lord North making policy and deciding, okay, we're not going to try to tax these folks. Very complicated issue here, and it's unclear what the result will be in 1774, 1775. Then at the end of 1775, the king does declare all of the colonists to be in rebellion, and Congress calls on two states that have asked, New Hampshire and South Carolina, they've asked Congress, what should we do? And Congress calls on them to draw up new governments. Some folks will say, okay, we'll draw up a new government just because we have this big crisis and we want to have a government in place. This is going to be particularly important in South Carolina, where more than half of the population actually is enslaved. So you can imagine what is going to happen in South Carolina to the ruling group in South Carolina if they're arguing about who is really in charge, when the real majority says, well, if these guys can't agree, we'll take power. That is, this is always a threat in South Carolina. Plus you have, civil war between these white folks in South Carolina about who is in charge. South Carolina needs some kind of a government in place, and you don't have to try to explain to each individual why your government is the one they should be paying the taxes to or supporting with your lives if necessary. Okay. Any questions on this? Kind of a very complicated story, difficult to make sense of. We all know how it ends, but then figuring out what's happening in the midst of it is really the difficult part. Yes, sir.
The South Carolina delegates, which of the two sort of warring sides, who were sending that representative?
That's a good question. Most of the delegates to the Continental Congress from any colony are being sent by the folks who will support Massachusetts, be more inclined to support independence, though they may not be saying that openly. I don't think, well, there are one or two perhaps who ultimately don't come around to independence, but some of the really important folks, well, Galloway is probably one of the most important, who remains a loyalist. John Dickinson, also from Pennsylvania. Now, Dickinson in 1768 had written the most important of the articles against the British Parliament's power to tax, the Farmers' Letters. Those great guys that you're a farmer in Pennsylvania and you have these problems with arbitrary power. Dickinson is a Philadelphia lawyer who had studied in London. He had, passed the bar at the Middle Temple in London, but he writes as a farmer, and about Parliament's power to tax. And the Farmers' Letters say that Parliament does not have the power to tax the colonies internally. Parliament can regulate trade, though. So an external tax is okay, not an internal tax. It's kind of a fine argument. I don't know if any of you is a farmer. I don't want to denigrate farmers, certainly, but it is an argument a Philadelphia lawyer would be more likely to make than a farmer in the backcountry of Pennsylvania. But Dickinson, during this period, is in Congress and trying to get Congress to reconcile with England, wanting reconciliation. And the idea is the problem has been caused by the king getting bad advice. We still believe in the empire, and the king is the figure who holds the empire together. The king can't be wrong. Okay? Parliament can be. Lord North can be. So Dickinson holds out this idea that ultimately what we want is reconciliation. Galloway holds out the same idea, in fact, much longer. Well, we can look at motive, but in South Carolina, the Rutledges really are sent by the group in South Carolina that is less likely to want reconciliation, and what they want is stability. And John Adams actually has in his diary very interesting observations on these different delegates, very cutting in some cases about some of them. And the South Carolinians he's really not impressed by at all. And the Virginians strike him in different ways. Remember, this gathering in 1774 is the first time a lot of these guys have met someone from one of these other places. And so Adams's observations on these places striking. And, look at other folks' observations on these individuals who show up in Philadelphia in 1774. Philadelphia itself is a different experience for many of these folks. For Adams, it's the first time in his life he goes to a Catholic church. In fact, Philadelphia is the only place in the British Empire where a Catholic Mass could be celebrated publicly, except for Quebec, which only recently had been added to the British Empire. And that, of course, was another grievance the people from Massachusetts had. We call these intolerable acts that Parliament passed suspending the Massachusetts government. One of the intolerable acts was Catholicism was okay in Quebec. And Massachusetts didn't like that at all, but they're getting a little sidetracked here. Anyway, any other questions on this really murky period, 1774, 1775? Yes? Excuse me, no, you can get ahead.
When you look at the Declaration, they keep saying they were okay with the king, we'll stick with the empire, just fearing the problem with Parliament to overstep themselves.
Yes.
But when you get to the Declaration of Independence, it's all about the king.
Exactly.
He did this.
That's a very good point. We have the real problem here is the British ministry. In fact, the troops in Boston are always called the ministerial troops, the troops sent by the ministers. Or the Parliament is really at fault. Parliament is trying to govern us. But then suddenly, in July of 1776, you have this indictment of the king. And I don't think anyone is more surprised by this than the king. Pauline Maier, in her book From Resistance to Revolution, has a chapter on the implication of the king and how this turnabout happens. And we'll talk about the Declaration in a bit. But you're right. You have this big build-up against parliamentary power, and the king is supposed to be the one who is going to bail us out. But then when he fails, it may be when he actually says, no, you're in rebellion, that they turn on him. It may be he's a better focal point for opposition. George III, I mentioned last time, George I and George II. George III really is intent on being the King of England. He takes a much bigger role in governing England than either his grandfather or great-grandfather. And he wants to fulfill this role as the patriot king. Both his grandfather, George II, and his great-grandfather spent considerable time in Germany because they were Elector of Hanover. George III is also Elector of Hanover. He never leaves England. He isn't really interested in governing the Principality of Hanover. He is interested in being King of England. And perhaps this was a warning to subsequent British monarchs not to interfere too much with government. On the other hand, we Americans do look at this in kind of a narrow way and don't look at the fact that George III remained King of England until 1820. And he went mad around by the late 1790s, and much of that time it was his son who becomes George IV, who is the monarch. But George III really presides over the triumph of the British Empire. First in this war with France in the he becomes king just after the big victories at Quebec and Montreal, but peace treaty of 1763 is signed when he was king, and then the victory over Napoleon. So this is the triumph of the British Empire. So go to England and you won't find George III as this figure everybody's embarrassed by. And he's, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to turn this into a great, apologia for George III. I'm expecting lightning to strike at any moment. But he does become this focal point, and perhaps that's because he's a better focal point than the ministry or the parliament. It's better to have one enemy, I suppose, than some body. Maybe. I could be wrong. But yeah, it is a big change. Any other questions which take us further afield or not? Okay. As I said, things are quite murky here in the 1773s, 4 and 5. Then in January of 1776, tremendous breakthrough politically with the publication of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, one of the great political pamphlets of all time. If this pamphlet were published today, and if as many people read it today as read it in 1776, it would be on the New York Times bestseller list. 3 million Americans, probably about a third or more, read Common Sense. Has anyone read it, by the way? Okay. Actually, more people than confessed last week to reading Locke and those other worthies. Okay, so Common Sense, written anonymously because nobody knew who Thomas Paine was. He had just arrived in America back in 1774, I think. Had kind of a checkered career in England. He had been a tax collector, had been a corset maker, done a number of things. Actually, what shall we say? He did abandon his wife and family to come to America and went into the writing business, and he became an editor of a magazine in Philadelphia. And then he was actually, I don't like to use the term hack writer because that implies that hacks, in order to be paid to write, you have to be pretty good. Okay? So, think about hack doctor may be different than hack writer. I don't know, do they talk about hack doctors? I suppose they do. Anyway, Thomas Paine, very good writer, and he does write for money. People pay him. Then again, remember what the great writer of this period, Samuel Johnson, said, "No one but a blockhead writes for anything but money." So, I'm sorry. So you have Paine writes Common Sense and argues that it doesn't make any sense for a continent to be governed by an island. That's part of it. Vivid call for independence. The thing people were afraid to mention, afraid they could not sustain. Paine says, we can do this. Look at the resources America has to create ships, the men we have, all of these great resources in America. And it's not just that. It's not just this practical case. It's a moral case. It's a moral imperative. We have it in our power to create the world anew. Liberty has been pursued throughout the globe, driven from Asia, expelled from Africa, under attack in Europe. Prepare a refuge for the fugitive and save mankind. This is the American cause. It's not just having Parliament stop taxing us. It is preparing a refuge for liberty and creating the world over again. It's a great, great thing. I get chills just thinking about it. But it's not only a call for independence. The other big question is, what kind of a government will we have? We have these 13 very different colonies with very different sets of governors and economic systems and so on. What kind of a government can we have here? How can we create something that will keep us from warring with each other? And the British Constitution is really a great thing. Paine says that's all nonsense. Everyone who talks about the British Constitution is just wrong about the British Constitution. Remember our old friend Montesquieu thought the British Constitution was a model of government. Paine says it's terrible. That the Constitution of England might have been good for the dark and slavish times in which it was created. It was a small remove from tyranny, but it's not enough now. Why do you need a king? Anyway, has anyone thought of that? Everyone here is saying we need a king, and the king should be the head of state. Why do you really need a king? Why do you need an aristocracy? You don't. The problem here seems to be, according to Paine, that you have these arbitrary guys, kings and aristocrats, who get in the way of the people, who should be able to govern themselves. That's the fundamental cause here, is governing ourselves. And if we don't have, how did you get kings in the first place? The kings are the descendants of the crowned ruffians of Europe. You had some gang, and the toughest guy in the gang becomes the leader, and then his children become the kings successively. Well, how does that make any sense? Why is this guy any better than anyone else? Why are you? Yeah, you're tough, okay, but so what? Should you have hereditary kings? This is an ongoing argument people will have in the 1780s, when Thomas Jefferson is American minister to France, he's in a discussion with a group of French intellectuals who do think, yes, the kings, they're trained in government. They're brought up as governors. And having a hereditary kingship is a good thing. And Jefferson says, of course, we also should have a hereditary professorship of mathematics. It's a change going on here. And Paine says, why do you need a king? Why do you need any check on the popular will? That's been the problem. These governors vetoing things, the king and his governors getting in the way of what people want to do. Do away with these constraints. A very powerful pamphlet. And Paine also says, the British Constitution is very complicated. Why not have a simpler government so when something goes wrong, you'll see what the problem is, without having a House of Lords, having committees, bureaucracy. Do away with all of that. And just have a simpler government, a single house representing the people. They can appoint an executive committee to run things when they're not in session. But you do away with the checks on the popular will, and things will be great. Now, it's a great pamphlet. It's impossible, I believe, for us to see the impact that this pamphlet had on the way Americans thought. And it's a troubling pamphlet for John Adams, who was the foremost advocate up till this point for independence. Now, he had been quite clear what the goal was, and that independence was what he was trying to move the other members of Congress towards supporting. Then suddenly this pamphlet comes out, an anonymous pamphlet making the case for independence, and a lot of people reading it assumed John Adams had written this. And Adams is quite horrified at this idea, not because he doesn't support independence, but because he thinks Thomas Paine is completely wrong about the proper role of government and the nature of government. This idea that you simply have the popular will running things, Adams thought would be a worse tyranny than the British Crown mucking things up. So you have Adams, in the spring of 1776, wrote a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government. It didn't sell as well as Common Sense, and it sets out just a few pages long. Has this great phrase. He actually writes this to delegates from South Carolina and New Hampshire and New Jersey, advising them on what kind of a government they should create. Paine says a simple government, simple legislative assembly. You don't need an executive or a governor to veto things, to check the popular will, because the people will be running things. It's democracy was what Paine is advocating. Does anyone here not believe in democracy, by the way? Okay, Ignacio is honest enough. You don't need to elaborate now. I see people looking at you with great suspicion now. I applaud you for it. John Adams didn't believe in democracy either. But he did say in this letter to these delegates, when have any people had a free choice in government any more than of air, climate, or soil? 3 million of people are able to choose what kind of a government they will have. We live, he said, in a time when the greatest sages of antiquity would have liked to have lived, because we have this free choice. Quite similar to what Paine says about creating the world anew, but Adams has somewhat of a different approach to this. And what he wants to do is create a government that is balanced, recognizing, I think, well, I don't want to use the word recognizing, it implies I'm taking a stand on this, suggesting there isn't such an entity as the people that has a common interest. People have lots of different interests. And the big interest we'll be talking more about next week is this interest of, some people have more money than others, more property than others. If the majority rules, the simplest way for the majority to get what it wants is simply to take away the property from those who have it and divide it up, right? That's why you don't like democracy.
Rule of the mob.
Excuse me? Rule of the mob, exactly. So what will check that? What will protect liberty where the majority rules? And that's the question Adams has, and the question he keeps trying to resolve. For Paine, the threats to liberty come from the king and the aristocrats. Adams sees there can be threats to liberty from those folks Ignacio has just called the mob. Other folks will have the similar idea. Now, Adams doesn't say, okay, the solution to this is to have all the rich people running things. Instead, what you should do is create a government where there is a house that represents the common people, and then a house that represents the propertied interest, a smaller deliberative body, and then a governor or an executive. This is the problem. With Parliament, the king represents the entire nation. He can check Parliament because members of Parliament have particular interests. How do you create someone within a Republican system who has an interest different from that of everybody else? Or the interest not the same as those within the legislative body? It's a very difficult problem. We'll be talking more about it as the weeks go by. In fact, you'll be talking about it probably for the rest of your lives as citizens. But this is the problem here. And so Adams wants to have a governor who will be able to check the majority in the legislature. You know, we had, British governors appointed by the king had vetoed things we wanted to do. That was a bad thing. But there has to be some check on the majority. And that's the big dilemma. So what we see here in the spring of 1776 is Thomas Paine's clarion call for independence and for doing away with this arbitrary structure of the British government. And you have John Adams, who also wants to do away with the British government in North America, but suggesting creating a more complicated government system as a way of protecting liberty and protecting property from the rule of the mob, to keep using Ignacio's phrase. Very interesting political debate. For Adams, the big debate in 1776, though, is not what kind of a government to create, but how to declare independence. And that's something we'll take a break at this point, and then we'll talk about what happens afterward.